Welcome back to part 2 of conducting a literature review lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to cover the different steps for conducting a literature review. Again, this is from our textbook, chapter 2. And to be honest, I think Thomas, Nelson, and Silverman have done an excellent job helping graduate students to understand how to write a literature review, the different steps, and it's an excellent chapter as far as how to do this. So make sure you read this chapter. Some of the material from the lecture and from the textbook are obviously going to be similar, but I'll also try to include some of my experience through this lecture. So what's the steps of conducting it, and then how to write your literature review. So the textbook talks about 6 steps in the literature review search. So first one is going to write a problem statement as that says there. We're going to do that next week, so I'm not going to spend any time in this lecture talking about that. So we'll talk about steps 2 through 6, which is second step is consult secondary sources, which I'll explain what those are. Determine descriptors, find primary sources, read and record the literature, and write the literature review. All right, so secondary sources. Secondary sources are good, legitimate resources. And so you should be using those primarily first, because what they do is provide us a big overview of the material. So some examples of secondary sources are encyclopedias, which aren't used too much these days. Research reviews. This can be like a meta-analysis. It can be a paper that provides a summary of all the different research that's been done. So it's a giant lit review. Think of it that way. Those are good because it gives you all the different research that's been done and gives you the conclusions. Internet. Now, you got to be very, very, very careful with using internet sources. An internet source that's obviously not good is what I have in there is no Wikipedia. Wikipedia is people adding to the material on Wikipedia. You can't trust it at all. And so with other internet sites, you have to make sure that it's just not somebody's opinion. If it's somebody's opinion, don't use it. Even some of the internet websites that you'll see, they seem like they're experts, but I would hesitate to say even using that. It might be helpful for just beginning a literature review or trying to get some information, but I wouldn't cite it in your papers. I wouldn't use it for your papers. If you're not sure, ask, and I'll send me the link, and I'll be happy to look at it at the website and tell you if it's a good source or a bad source. I'm happy to help you with that. Textbooks are probably one of the best secondary sources that you can use, because what they do is provide you the big picture of the research that's been done. That's what textbook authors need to do, is they have to get into the primary sources, which we'll talk about here in a bit, all their research studies, and then provide a overview for the student to use for coursework. So textbooks are really good. Now, the thing you should realize, your secondary sources should not be your main references that you use for a research paper, such as we're doing in this class. Obviously not for a thesis or dissertation, but for class assignments here in the master's program, you can have 1 or 2 secondary sources, such as textbooks and some of those research review articles. But your primary sources should be, the majority of your sources should be primary resources. Some other literature to avoid and not use, in other words, newspapers. That's just somebody's opinion. Magazines, Sports Illustrated, ESPN, all those type of things. Again, it's not for academic purposes. They're not good resources. Interviews of experts is kind of borderline Depends on what the project, the assignment is about. For this class, the research methods course, interviews for is not to be accepted for your signature assignment. Blogs definitely aren't. Blog is somebody's opinion on things, and again, Wikipedia, just not good resources to use for our class, any of our graduate courses. So keep that in mind. So your next step after you've consulted secondary sources, and again, what we're trying to do here is get from a very, very general topic and narrow it down. And this is when you're doing the actual search for literature in the library, in the databases, which I'll talk about, I believe, later on in this series of presentations. So here I have a purpose statement from my dissertation. So the red letters are descriptors that I'm looking for when I'm doing my literature review. So I would search novice, and ATS stands for athletic training student. So I would search novice athletic training student. Then I would search experienced athletic training student. Then I would search entry level. KHEP is what those initials stand for. That's how we say. That's how the National Athletic Trainers Association used to do the accreditation for our athletic training education programs, which is ATEP. Now it's just NETA, so I would change it now if I was doing the search, but back when I did my dissertation, that's where we did it. So it would be undergraduate entry-level athletic training education programs. We can manipulate those descriptors quite a few different ways. Another descriptor for when I was doing my literature review for my dissertation was professional socialization. So we can search the literature in multiple different descriptors. And then you have to expand as you do more research, because as you start searching and finding more articles, you'll see that other authors use different terms. And so then you have to go into the descriptors again and start searching for that when you're doing your literature review search. Like when I was doing my dissertation, professional socialization is also known as occupational socialization. So when I was doing my lit review search, when I started doing all the work to do that, I had to look for occupational and professional socialization, because both terms are the same thing. The other thing you have to do is expand beyond just kinesiology. We have to look beyond just PE or athletic training. We may need to go into nursing if you're an athletic trainer, or medical education or physical therapy education. Same with physical education. You may need to go into just education theory in general and see what the research is telling us about your particular area. Should be similar, but you may need, the sport administration students may need to go into the business area, because sport administration is business of athletics. So you may need to search within the business areas with those terms to find out what kind of research has been done in your particular area in those type of journals or those particular areas. Most of the databases, which we'll talk about later, also have thesauruses, or you can just use a thesaurus on your computer and find out what are some other words that are similar to socialization. What's some other words that are similar to professional or occupational, and plug those in to help you find more articles. That's the whole point of this part of the lecture, is to help you try to find more and more articles for your literature review. Now, primary sources. That's our next step, is we need to find primary sources. Primary sources also can be called peer-reviewed or journal articles, but because that's what they are. Again, we'll talk about how to find these during this lecture a little bit later. So you'll see me use some terms like peer review or journal articles. What these are articles from a journal. So it can be Journal of Athletic Training for us athletic trainers. It can be Journal of, I'm blanking on some of the kinesiology journal article titles off the top of my head. But they typically starts with the title Journal of, something like that. What these articles typically are is original research. They're research studies conducted by people either like me as a professor or as a graduate student. So these articles have been reviewed by peers, hence the term peer reviewed, by experts in those particular areas to make sure that the material is accurate and correct before they publish it. So we, as the people reading it, can feel good about using them because they have been approved by the journal organization, saying that the data, the conclusions, the methodology is all correct, and we can use this information to inform our decisions for our own research, or as I spoke about in part one, to influence the way we teach, the way we take care of patients, how we administer sports programs. As it says there in bullet 2, your primary sources should be your main source for the review of literature. These are the gold standard for academic work and for us to make decisions for our profession. Key thing you should do is when you're searching is read the abstract first, just to see if it's even worth your time to fully read. An abstract is just a brief overview or summary of a article. Each journal does it a little bit differently, as you'll see as you start collecting articles. But read it first. You can typically read these on your computer before you download it and scan through it. And does this have anything to do with the research that I'm interested in? It may not, so you don't need to keep it. Just move on. Try and read the next abstract and go on. Again, these are research studies. Some of the stuff that's in the journal articles is also secondary in the sense that they are literature reviews. They provide us, it's called a meta-analysis, or a large overview of all the previous research that has been done. And there's nothing wrong with those. It's borderline primary because these researchers did not conduct original research. They're providing a summary of previous research, but they're still good articles and still should be used. And the next step is obviously you have to read all the stuff that you have found and then record what the literature, what the authors of the previous literature has found. I'm going to give you a method to how to record the literature that's from the book again. You can either use your Word document, like Word processor, index cards, notebook, spreadsheet to record the critical information. The big thing is stay organized. Keep it in an organized fashion that will help you. There are some other programs out there that you can also use. I think the university subscribes to one. I'm not too familiar with it. I typically use my Word document, Microsoft Word, and I'll show you what I have. All right, so page 43 of the textbook gives us some ideas what we should do. Let's say we're just using a Microsoft Word document. So at the top of one page of your page, you're going to provide the APA Annotex reference, which is another way of saying the reference page. How would you reference it in the reference page of a paper? The reason why you do that is just to know what article that you read. These should be placed in alphabetical order because that's how it's going to be in your reference page. And then you're going to provide we can call this an annotated bibliography, but these are the big things that you should provide in your recording of each article. That's a good article. Again, if it's not a helpful article, there's no reason to record this. So you want to have the statement of the problem, or this is also known as purpose statement, purpose sentence, problem statement. That could be used multiple different ways. Just copy and paste it if you can, or just rewrite it the same words from the article. Cite it. According to APA, you would put quotation marks around it. You would give the page number where you got this quote, because that way you don't have to go back and find it later. If the article has hypotheses, provide those. Characteristics of the participant. Who were the subjects? Who were the participant? How many were there? What these, I said in one of the other lectures, we're talking about the delimitations and the limitations. That's what's going on here is the characteristics. How did the authors delimit the study? What are some limitations to the study? And again, we'll talk about that next week. Just the characteristics. Age, maybe, male, female, how many total, all those different things that will be helpful for you. Instruments are the surveys, the testing equipment that they use to conduct their research. If they use a survey, what survey was it? How accurate is it? We call that reliability and validity. And how is it used? And that's the testing procedure. How did they conduct the study? Now, the variables is to help you understand the independent and dependent variables, which we'll talk about next week. You should list those too, so you can keep those straight in your mind. What's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable that are identified? You should be able to determine those out of the purpose statement or the research questions. So the treatment's applied. In an experiment, we do a treatment. We have several groups of students, or several groups of subjects or participants, and then we do some kind of experiment with that. And then we call that a treatment. And then some of them don't. So we just have to explain that. What did they do? What design did they do? Was it a quasi-experimental design? Was it a survey design? And what kind of statistical analysis did they use? You should be just taking this straight from the journal article. Now the findings. The findings are what's the main points? What's the big points, the takeaways from the article? And what's the takeaway to your particular study that you're thinking about doing? What's the connection to the research that you're involved in? That's the findings. Now, the authors of the journal article may provide you questions for further study. Write those down. If they don't, what questions came to mind when you're reading it? Just write them down. Citations to other studies. What this is meaning is their reference page. And I'll talk about why that's important in just a bit. When to copy the article. What I mean by that is when to actually have the article in the folder, or if you're like me, I try to do everything electronic now. So I have a folder for articles, and then I download them and then put them in that folder. If it's a good article that is linked to your research, that's when you should copy it. And the asterisks there are the really important information that you really should record for your literature review. All right, so our next step is to really analyze the literature for the review. Well, one of the things you got to determine is this literature any good? Is it accurate? Is it a good source? And again, you might want to do this at the very beginning before you start taking all these notes. Select those peer-reviewed journal articles. One of the things you have to start with, maybe later in this semester, is were the research methods appropriate for the purpose? It's one of the things that I'm going to be looking for for your signature assignment, did you develop correct research methods to answer your research question or to test your hypothesis? And if the answer is no, your paper won't be all that good. So you have to make sure that you can understand how they develop their methods in order to answer their research question or the purpose statement. Do you think the conclusions and findings are accurate, or were they just no way that they can link what they said about their research to previous findings, and were the conclusions correct? Just because it's been published doesn't mean it's always correct. I mean, we talked about the peer review process, but it's still our job as scholarly kinesiology practitioners to analyze the conclusions and findings of journal articles. That's what separates undergraduate students from graduate students. We need to be able to evaluate and analyze material and make a judgment if it's acceptable, accurate, and correct. Again, is it relevant to your research? Was it the same topic of your study, or is it something different? Is it the same kind of literature that you hope to use, or is it completely different? Meaning, like, is it nursing, or is it medical education, or is it something else? How similar is that research question to yours? At the beginning of this process, you may not have a research question just yet, but you're still exploring. But when you do write your research question, is it close to what you have? It doesn't have to be exactly the same. It should be in a general ballpark, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. Typically, the things that will change are you can change the variables, the independent or dependent variables, and obviously your participants, the subjects, can be different. And you may also change some of the other things in the study, but it still can be similar to what you have talked about or what you plan to do and what they've done. Now, after you've done all this work, you have to actually write your literature review. One thing I think is really helpful for you is you develop an outline. The outline can be either topical, which means you have different topics that you're going to address throughout your literature review, or it can be a chronological outline. It could be a topical that is chronological by the research. So organize, help the reader understand the topic, theories, and issue. Think about if you're reading it, how would you want it to be organized? What would help you understand the material? When you've read some of these articles and so like that, some of them were written well and some you had a hard time following. So try to follow the ones that were written well so it helps you to understand. And use section headings and follow APA with that. And the reason why we do section headings, it helps the reader to understand what point are we talking about here. Oh, okay, so we're talking about this point right now. So everything I read should be focused around this particular topic. Okay, so how much information should you give to us, the people who are going to be reading it? There's some articles that are your most important articles. They're critical studies. They're the foundation. Well, you should provide quite a bit of information back with those. And some articles are directly related, and so you should be addressing those. Again, the one way to think of this is, again, how much information does a person who has a little bit of understanding of this material, how much do you have to provide them? So a person with little understanding will be able to completely understand the topic. One thing you can do as you're writing papers, if you know somebody who is not involved in our kinesiology area, have them read it and see if they can understand your point when you're writing papers, not just for this particular class, but for every class in this graduate program. Now, for a literature review, if you're actually doing a true literature review in a thesis or a dissertation, and for a journal article will be a bit different, because we talked about that in one of the other presentations, is that you should have an introduction. Tell the reader what they're going to read about. The body is the main part of any paper. And again, that's when you would separate it either in a topical or a chronological order. Then the third section is summary and conclusions. After you have written all these different parts in the body, how does this connect to your research study or project? Make it clear to the reader what the linkage to the previous research and to your research. So by the time they end reading the literature review, they have a good understanding of why you provided all this background information and how does it connect to what I'm doing or what you're doing. How long? It really depends on how much literature is out there. I mean, I've seen literature reviews be 50 pages. I've seen some of them be 20 pages. For this assignment in our particular class, I have limitations on this. You're not actually doing a literature review. Your literature review is part of your introduction and part of your conclusion sections. So I have limitations on that, but for a journal article, they would limit it too. And so it really depends on what you're doing. Now I'm going to switch gears a bit, talk about scholarly writing. Thomas Nelson and Silverman talk about this too. Again, chapter 2 is an excellent chapter for not just a literature review in all things, but literature review for a thesis or dissertation, but it's also good for writing any of your academic papers here for our program. And so I'll briefly go through these because I want to be concise, because that's one of our points, is your paper should be straight to the point. You don't need to have a lot of flowery speech and stuff like that. Get to the point. And what I mean by bias free is that when you're writing most papers in this grad program, and specifically for the signature assignments in this class, you shouldn't bias the way you write. You need to be neutral in your writing. Don't let me know what side of everything that you're coming on. It's hard for me to explain bias-free. Trying to think about that. Your paper should be presented orderly and logically. Keep it clear. Keep it straightforward. Have some structure to it. Use the correct verb tense. Typically, we're going to use past verb tense because everything that happened in the past. The next bullet is economy of expression. Less is more. This is really hard to do, is saying less with more. It takes a lot of work to write that way. And so if you are not the strongest writer in the world, you need to find somebody to help you with this type of stuff. They should not write your papers, but they still can help you edit your papers. And also use correct grammar, which I'll talk about here in a second. Some things you should definitely avoid is jargon. And again, see the textbook for that. Jargon we all use it in our everyday speech. So try to avoid a lot of jargon language in your writing. I'll give you an example straight out of the textbook. The authors give an example of jargon as a variety of. That's the jargon. And the preferred usage is many. That's a good example of economy of words and not using just a bunch of wasted words. Redundancy, saying the same thing over and over and over again, or saying similar things in a similar way all the time. This has to do with writing. Again, if you're not strong in writing, this is when you need to get help. Yes, I'm being redundant about that. Colloquialisms is writing as you talk, or using things like catchphrases. I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't think of any of them right now, but if you see me in your papers, that's a colloquialism. I even have a hard time saying that word. You should not be using those type of language. Again, that's not just in this class. This is every class in the grad program. Avoid second person. Second person is using you, your, or you are. It's just poor writing. Either use, in this particular assignment, the signature assignment for this class, you'll use third person, and so you will not use first or second person. First person is I, we, us. It's personal to you for this particular assignment. Most of the papers in this program will be written in third person and past tense. So I can tell you right now, in any of my classes, do not ever use second person. If you're asked to have an opinion about something, or it's been a personal thing, then you could typically use first person. But usually with research, you want to use third person. All right, so what do we talk about in this particular lecture? We talked about how to conduct a literature review, the different steps for the literature review, and how to write your literature review. Again, use the textbook too. It has really good resources for you. The next lecture, I'm going to talk about how you actually get the articles. How do we do a library search?